Welcome to my channel. Today, we delve into a chilling tale that began with a routine flight across calm skies but ended in one of the most haunting moments in aviation history. It was supposed to be an easy, peaceful cruise above the clouds, passengers relaxed, flight attendants serving meals, and the pilots chatting casually inside the cockpit. But at 39,000 feet, a sudden silence crept through the engines, a silence no pilot ever wants to hear. The low hum that defined life aboard the aircraft faded into an eerie stillness. Then came the unthinkable words over the radio, "We've lost both engines. We're out of fuel." Inside that pressurized metal tube 39,000 feet above Earth, time seemed to stop. The captain looked at his co-pilot, disbelief frozen on his face, the instruments blinking warnings like heartbeat. How could a state-of-the-art jetliner, filled with hundreds of passengers, be out of fuel? As panic began to stir among the cabin crew, the pilots fought to maintain composure. They switched systems, checked gauges, cross-verified instruments, hoping it was a sensor error. But it wasn't. The fuel tanks were dry. They were gliding, not flying. The cockpit was filled with alarms, but the sound that terrified them most was the quiet wind brushing against the fuselage, reminding them that gravity was now in control. The control tower's voice crackled through the radio, urgent but calm. "Flight, confirm your situation." The captain's reply sent chills down every spine listening. "Mayday, Mayday, we've lost all power, both engines out, altitude 390. The words echoed through the airwaves, reaching dispatchers, engineers, and even nearby pilots who couldn't believe what they were hearing. A commercial jetliner, completely powerless, was descending fast through thin, freezing air. In the cabin, the passengers sensed something was wrong. The flight attendants moved quickly, whispering reassurances, though fear trembled in their voices. The plane's lights flickered, and the sound of rushing air filled the cabin like a storm inside a tunnel. A mother clutched her sleeping child tighter. A businessman gripped his armrest until his knuckles turned white. Everyone's mind went to the same thought: this couldn't be happening. The co-pilot ran through checklists at lightning speed, scanning for any possible solution. Could they restart the engines? Could they divert to a nearby airport? But with no fuel, there was only one grim option. They had to glide, find a runway or open field, and pray they could reach it. Far below, radar screens at air traffic control showed the aircraft dropping altitude rapidly. Controllers scrambled to clear airspace, guiding nearby aircraft away while coordinating rescue teams. The captain's voice grew calm. Too calm, a tone only heard when experience meets fear. "Let's try a restart," he said. The co-pilot pulled the levers, following each step. Silence. Then again. Silence. A faint spark, a whine, a flicker of hope, then darkness. The engines refused to respond. The captain's jaw tightened as he adjusted the yoke, trying to control descent with only the glide ratio and faith in physics. Every second was borrowed time. As the plane cut through clouds, mountains appeared in the distance. They were too close, too high. The captain banked left, using what little altitude they had left. The airspeed dropped dangerously low. A stall warning blared, a desperate electronic scream that no pilot ever wants to hear. The aircraft shuddered. Passengers gasped. But the captain's hands stayed steady. Years of training, endless simulations, and instinct took over. He knew panic was death. He lowered the nose slightly, regained speed, and stabilized the glide. They spotted a stretch of land below, a deserted airstrip once used for military training. The odds of reaching it were slim, but it was their only chance. Inside the cabin, the purser made the announcement with trembling lips: "Brace, brace, brace." Passengers bent forward, eyes closed, prayers whispered into the air. The crew moved swiftly, securing the cabin, strapping in, tears glistening in the emergency lights. The co-pilot guided the approach as the captain lined up with the abandoned runway. Trees loomed on both sides. They were too low, too fast, and the runway was shorter than any commercial jet had ever used. The captain adjusted flaps manually, every motion deliberate, every breath counted. The aircraft skimmed treetops, metal scraping against branches, sparks flying. Then, a violent impact. Tires burst, wings bent, but the fuselage stayed intact. The jet slid down the cracked concrete, finally stopping in a cloud of dust and smoke. Silence returned, this time filled with disbelief. When the dust settled, the pilots turned to each other, stunned. Against all odds, they had pulled off what many would later call a miracle. Emergency exits opened, and passengers stumbled out into the sunlight, shaking, crying, kissing the ground. The captain stepped out last, eyes scanning the damage, heart pounding, every muscle trembling with the realization of what they had survived. Later investigations would reveal a shocking truth. A miscalculation during refueling, a decimal error that left the aircraft with less than half the required fuel. A mistake so small it hid in the paperwork, but so deadly it almost cost hundreds of lives. The flight would forever be remembered as the miracle glide from 39,000 feet. As the story spread, experts called it one of aviation's most extraordinary survivals. The captain's quick thinking, calm under pressure, and refusal to surrender became legend. The flight crew's teamwork under unimaginable stress reminded the world that even when machines fail, human courage can still defy gravity itself. The wrecked aircraft, later dismantled and studied, became a symbol of resilience, a steel monument to the day the sky went silent, and yet hope found a way to land. If you found this story as gripping as we did, remember to subscribe to the channel for more real-life air disaster stories that remind us how fragile and miraculous flight can be. The sun dipped below the horizon as investigators gathered around the scorched wreckage, their flashlights cutting through the twilight mist. The miracle landing was now the focus of every aviation expert in the world. But as the rescue teams moved across the field, their boots crunching over debris, a strange quiet filled the air. The passengers had been taken to safety, some with minor injuries, some still trembling in shock, and yet the captain refused to leave the site. He stood there, his uniform covered in soot, his eyes fixed on the motionless aircraft that had once carried hundreds of souls through the sky. He couldn't shake the question echoing in his head, how did they run out of fuel? He knew every checklist had been followed, every number verified, yet something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. The flight data recorders were recovered that night, their orange casings glinting under floodlights like sleeping witnesses to the chaos that had unfolded at 39,000 feet. Hours earlier, before the engines died, everything had seemed perfect. The flight had taken off from a bustling city airport, its passengers filled with the usual mix of excitement and exhaustion. Businessmen opened laptops, children pressed faces against the windows, and lovers whispered promises of a new beginning. The crew moved down the aisles with practiced smiles, unaware that fate had already started its countdown. In the cockpit, the captain, a veteran with decades of experience, chatted easily with his co-pilot, a younger man still earning his stripes but sharp, focused, and eager to learn. They discussed weather conditions, route adjustments, and even joked about the calm skies ahead. Everything looked normal, and the plane climbed smoothly to cruising altitude. Then came the first subtle warning. The fuel gauge on the left tank dropped faster than expected. The co-pilot frowned, tapped the display, and reported it to the captain. It wasn't alarming yet, but it was strange enough to note. The captain double-checked the system, cross-verifying with backup readings. They all showed the same thing. Fuel consumption was off. He radioed maintenance control, reporting the anomaly. The response came back calm, routine. It's likely a sensor issue, Captain. Keep monitoring and report any changes. The captain nodded, but deep down, a flicker of unease stirred. Hours passed, the world below blanketed in clouds, the horizon painted in soft orange glow. Then, as they crossed into a new air sector, a sharp beeping sound cut through the cockpit. The right engine's fuel pressure warning illuminated. The captain and co-pilot exchanged a glance that said everything. 1 warning was coincidence, 2 was danger. They began a series of checks, draining fuel from one tank to balance the other, running through emergency procedures they'd only ever rehearsed in simulators. The air felt heavier, the cockpit lights more intense. Then came the sound, the sputter. A low, uneven cough from the right engine. The vibration was subtle at first, then violent, shaking the controls as if the plane itself were gasping for breath. "Engine 2 flame out," the co-pilot said, voice tight. The captain immediately took control, adjusting the throttle. He tried reignition, but the engine remained dead. The checklist flashed in his mind like instinct, but before he could speak, the left engine followed. Within seconds, the cockpit plunged into a surreal silence. No roar, no hum, just wind. The only sound that remained was the whine of air slicing past the fuselage. They were gliding, an enormous machine weighing hundreds of tons, now a silent bird falling through the night. The captain steadied his voice. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 982, both engines out, altitude 390. Down below, air traffic controllers froze. The radar showed a steady descent, altitude dropping fast. Confirm, both engines?" one controller asked, hoping it was a misunderstanding. "Affirmative," came the calm yet chilling response. In that moment, the entire control center sprang into action, rerouting flights, alerting emergency services, calculating possible glide path. But the numbers didn't look good. The nearest airport was over 80 miles away. With their current altitude and glide ratio, they'd fall short by at least 10 miles. The controllers knew it, the pilots knew it, but no one said it out loud. There was still hope, there had to be. The captain took a deep breath and began planning a miracle. He instructed the co-pilot to shut off unnecessary systems to preserve battery life, switch the transponder to emergency, and prepare for a glide approach. The cabin crew was informed next, their faces pale as they received the impossible order: prepare passengers for a no-power landing. The lead attendant's voice cracked slightly as she made the announcement: "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and follow all instructions. We are experiencing technical difficulties." Those words, so often rehearsed, now carried a terrifying truth. In the cabin, whispers spread like wildfire. A child asked her mother why the plane sounded different. An elderly man gripped his rosary tighter. Somewhere, a woman began to cry quietly. Back in the cockpit, the captain focused on his instruments, his heartbeat matching the rapid descent. He wasn't just fighting gravity now. He was fighting time, terrain, and fate itself. The co-pilot's hands shook slightly as he adjusted trim and flaps, trying to extend their glide distance. "We might make the old military strip," the captain muttered, scanning the terrain map. It was their only shot, a decommissioned airfield from decades ago. No lights, no guidance systems, just cracked concrete surrounded by forest. The co-pilot looked doubtful, but the captain's tone left no room for hesitation. "We make it, or we die trying." The descent became steeper. Ice crystals formed on the windows as the outside temperature plunged. The captain could feel the controls stiffening, the air density changing. He adjusted manually, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. The co-pilot coordinated with air traffic, his voice steady even as his throat dried. "We're attempting an emergency landing," he said. "Altitude 1000, descending through cloud layer." The controller's response came with hesitation. "You don't have enough range, Captain. You may have to ditch." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Negative. We'll make it." His voice carried a conviction that silenced doubt. Breaking through the clouds, they saw it, the faint outline of the abandoned runway. It was shorter than expected, tilted, covered in overgrown grass and debris, but it was salvation. The captain's instincts took over. "Flaps full," he commanded. "Gear down." The sound of the landing gear deploying felt like thunder after the endless silence. The co-pilot managed the checklist with trembling hands as the altimeter wound down fast. The stall warning blared again, but the captain ignored it, pushing the aircraft forward, gliding on sheer willpower. The runway grew closer, and every second stretched into eternity. Passengers braced, the crew prayed, and the captain aimed for the narrow strip of survival beneath them. The impact was brutal. The tires burst on contact, metal screeched against the tarmac, and the wings clipped the edges of the runway, sending sparks flying into the night. Oxygen masks swung violently, overhead bins burst open, and the cabin filled with the sound of chaos and fear. Yet somehow, miraculously, the fuselage held together. The jet slid to a stop at the far edge of the airstrip, nose tilted slightly, smoke rising from the left engine housing. For a long, haunting moment, there was no sound, no screams, no movement, just silence, heavy and unreal. Then, as if breaking a spell, a baby cried somewhere in the back, followed by the sobs of relief from passengers who realized they were still alive. The captain sat motionless for several seconds, staring straight ahead, his hands still gripping the controls. His co-pilot whispered, "We made it." The captain's voice was low, distant. "No," he said softly, "we survived it." He looked out the cockpit window at the dark airfield illuminated only by rescue lights approaching from afar, and he knew this flight would never be forgotten. It wasn't just a crash avoided, it was humanity's defiance against the impossible. And somewhere deep inside, even as exhaustion weighed him down, he smiled faintly. They had beaten death at 39,000 feet, with no fuel, no power, and no hope, only courage. Night had fallen completely when the investigators set up camp around the battered aircraft, their lights glinting off torn metal and shattered glass, the smell of jet fuel still lingering faintly in the cold air. The field, once silent and forgotten, was now alive with voices. Rescuers, technicians, and journalists whispering the same word again and again: miracle. The passengers had been taken to safety, but their faces haunted every rescuer who had looked into their eyes. There was something deeper in that gaze, something that said they had touched death and somehow walked back from it. The captain sat a few yards away from the wreck, his uniform torn, hands still trembling from adrenaline. His co-pilot sat beside him, head in his hands, replaying the glide again and again in his mind, hearing every alarm, every click of a switch that hadn't responded, every moment where they were seconds away from the end. As dawn broke, a soft fog rolled across the airfield, cloaking the twisted aircraft in a ghostly veil. Investigators from the Aviation Board arrived in dark jackets marked with reflective stripes, their breath visible in the morning chill. They began their work methodically, measuring skid marks, collecting debris, and photographing the cockpit instruments. The captain watched silently as one of them removed the flight recorder, the so-called black box, from the wreckage. Its bright orange casing seemed almost cruelly cheerful against the gray wreck. Somewhere deep inside that little machine lay the truth of what had happened, the moment the fuel had run dry, the sequence of alarms, the words spoken between two men who refused to give up. While the investigation team worked, the news spread across the world. Major networks interrupted broadcasts to cover the story. Passenger jet glides 39,000 feet with no power, everyone survives. The world called it divine intervention, a miracle of skill, an act of fate. But the captain didn't feel like a hero. He couldn't shake the thought that something had gone wrong long before they took off, something hidden beneath layers of paperwork and routine. Later that afternoon, as the investigators reviewed the maintenance logs, one of them frowned. The fuel entry looked odd. It listed a number that seemed correct at first glance, but when double-checked against flight duration and engine output, it was short. Very short. He ran the calculation twice, then a third time. The result didn't change. A decimal error. Someone had entered the amount in pounds instead of kilograms, cutting the total fuel almost in half. It was a small human mistake, invisible to the eye, but powerful enough to bring down a jet from the heavens. When the captain heard the explanation, he went silent. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply looked toward the sky, as if searching for the invisible line where it had all begun. He knew how easy it was to trust the system, to rely on numbers printed neatly on a refueling log. Pilots trusted ground crews, crews trusted data, and data trusted machines. But one tiny slip, a single misplaced decimal, had almost erased hundreds of lives. Later, during the official hearing, the investigators played the cockpit recording. The faint hum of normal flight filled the room at first, punctuated by calm voices. Then came the warnings, the alarms, the silence. When the captain's voice broke through, steady and unshaken, "Mayday, both engines out," the room went quiet. Even hardened investigators looked away, imagining what it felt like to stare at a blank instrument panel knowing there was no way back but down. Survivors began to tell their stories on television. A mother described how she held her child and whispered prayers she didn't remember learning. A man who had been an atheist all his life admitted he had prayed, too. A flight attendant said she saw the captain's eyes just before the landing and knew he wasn't thinking of himself, only of the lives behind that cockpit door. People sent letters from around the world, calling him a hero, a symbol of human strength and composure. But the captain couldn't read them without feeling the weight of what could have happened if the runway had been 10 feet shorter, if the glide angle had been 1 degree steeper, if just one passenger hadn't fastened a seatbelt. Hero or not, he knew it was luck as much as courage that had carried them to the ground. Weeks later, when the investigation concluded, the airline publicly accepted responsibility. The refueling operator had been overworked, handling multiple aircraft that morning. A single keystroke, one error in conversion, had set the tragedy in motion. The man broke down during questioning, apologizing through tears, saying he would never forgive himself. The captain, sitting across from him, placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "You made a mistake, but we all lived. Learn from it. Make sure it never happens again." Those words, caught on camera, went viral. They reminded the world that even in disaster, compassion mattered. But deep within the captain, the experience had changed something forever. He found himself waking at night, hearing the silence of the engines, feeling again that weightless moment before the descent. He kept dreaming of the clouds opening, the world falling away beneath the wings. He visited the wreck one last time before it was dismantled, walking along the torn fuselage, running his hand across the scars in the metal. He whispered to it, as if speaking to a living thing, thanking it for holding together when everything else had failed. And when he looked up, the sunrise painted the sky in gold and crimson, just like it had on that morning before the flight. For the first time since the crash, he smiled. The jet's remains were transported to a museum months later, rebuilt into a quiet exhibit titled "The Flight That Glided Home." Visitors walked through the restored cabin, listening to audio recordings of the event. Children asked questions, couples stood silently holding hands, and every person who stepped inside felt the same awe, that even at 39,000 feet, when the engines fell silent and the world expected the worst, human courage refused to give in. And so the story became legend, told in classrooms and documentaries, whispered in airports and flight schools around the world. It was no longer just about a crash or a miracle. It was about the fragile thread that connects trust, precision, and hope. Because up there, above the clouds, when machines stop and the world falls away, what remains isn't power or fuel, it's heart, instinct, and the will to survive. The months after the crash were a blur of headlines, interviews, and investigations, yet for those who had been on that plane, the noise of the world couldn't drown out the sound of silence they had heard at 39,000 feet. The passengers returned to their lives, but they were not the same. Some developed a newfound faith. Others carried quiet fear every time they saw a jet streak across the sky. The captain, now grounded for recovery and review, spent his days in therapy sessions, reliving the sequence frame by frame. Every question from the investigators replayed the nightmare. When did you realize fuel was gone? Why didn't you divert earlier? How did you keep control? He answered each with calm professionalism, but inside, he felt something deeper, a fracture between duty and disbelief. Pilots were trained to trust instruments, yet his instruments had betrayed him. That betrayal lingered like a scar invisible to the world but heavy on his soul. Back home, his house had become a quiet shrine to survival. On the mantel sat a small photograph, his crew standing in front of the aircraft before takeoff, smiling. It was supposed to be a routine flight, yet now every face in that photo carried the weight of fate. He replayed the cockpit recordings alone sometimes, not out of morbid fascination but to remind himself of the calm that had saved them all. Each breath, each instruction, each moment of silence reminded him of what it meant to lead when everything falls apart. The co-pilot visited often, sitting across the table, both of them nursing coffee that always went cold. "I still hear the engines going quiet," the younger man confessed one night, staring at his hands. "Every time I close my eyes." The captain nodded, his voice soft. "That sound will stay with us. But so will what we did after." The airline's internal report concluded with a chilling line. "This incident demonstrates that even in the most advanced systems, a single human error can ignite a chain of near-catastrophic failure." Yet buried beneath the technical jargon was a line handwritten by the lead investigator: "Skill saved lives." That note became something of a mantra for pilots everywhere. Flight academies began teaching a new module inspired by the event: energy management during total power loss. The captain's name became synonymous with composure under pressure. But he didn't want fame. When journalists asked him what he thought of being called a hero, his response was always the same: "I did my job." The real miracle was teamwork. One night, months after the incident, the captain received a letter in the mail. It was from a little girl who had been on the flight. The note was written in messy handwriting with pink ink. "Dear Captain, thank you for landing the plane. I wasn't scared because you sounded brave. I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up." He read the words over and over, his eyes blurring. That letter broke something open inside him, a dam of guilt, fear, and gratitude all at once. He framed it and placed it above his desk, right next to the checklist he'd used that day, marked by trembling hands and fuel-stained ink. As the anniversary of the incident approached, the airline organized a remembrance ceremony at the restored airframe exhibit. Survivors gathered once more, faces familiar yet distant, each carrying their own version of that day. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and for a moment the captain felt as though time had folded back on itself. Standing before the aircraft, now gleaming under soft museum lights, he placed his hand against its side. The metal felt cold but alive. "You brought us home," he whispered quietly, and those nearby could sense the reverence in his voice. When he turned to speak, his tone was steady but filled with weight. "Machines can fail. Numbers can lie. But people can rise above everything. That day we were not just pilots and passengers. We were one heartbeat, one purpose." The crowd fell silent. Even the journalists lowered their cameras. After the ceremony, the captain walked outside to the edge of the airfield. The night was calm, the stars scattered like tiny fires above him. For a moment, the same sky that had terrified him now felt peaceful, forgiving. The co-pilot joined him, standing quietly by his side. "You ever think about flying again?" the younger man asked. The captain smiled faintly. "Every day. But it's different now. I used to fly for the challenge, for the freedom. Now I think I fly to remember." The two men stood in silence, the distant hum of a departing plane echoing through the night. It was the sound of engines, alive, powerful, steady. The kind of sound they would never take for granted again. When Flight 982's story was turned into a documentary, the producers interviewed everyone involved, from the passengers to the investigators, from the refueling crew to the air traffic controllers. What emerged was not just a story of survival but a tapestry of human connection under impossible odds. The documentary aired worldwide, titled "No Fuel, No Power, No Hope." Viewers watched in awe as they learned how the pilots had turned a doomed aircraft into a glider, guiding it with precision, courage, and calm. One sequence showed the flight path, tracing the descent across dark terrain to the small patch of concrete where the plane touched down. The narrator's voice broke slightly as he said, "They didn't land by chance, they landed because they refused to give up." As time passed, the world moved on to new stories, new headlines, but the legacy of that flight lingered in every safety briefing, every simulator session, every quiet moment before takeoff. The captain eventually returned to the skies, not as a pilot in command, but as an instructor, training new aviators in crisis management. He stood before classrooms of eager students, showing them footage from that night, explaining every decision, every instinct. "When everything fails," he told them, "your voice becomes the only steady thing your crew will hear. Make sure it never shakes." The room would always fall silent after those words, every student imagining themselves in that cockpit, the sky silent, the world waiting. Even years later, whenever he passed through airports, someone would recognize him, an old passenger, a flight attendant, or a young pilot who'd studied his case. They would stop him, shake his hand and say, "You gave us hope." He would smile, thank them politely, and keep walking, but deep down, he knew hope wasn't something he gave. It was something they all shared at 39,000 feet when the engines went quiet and humanity took over. The world may remember the flight for its numbers, its statistics, and its technical miracle, but for those who lived it, it would always be remembered differently, not as the day a plane fell, but as the day courage learned to fly without wings. The years slipped by, but the story of that impossible flight never faded from memory. It lived on in flight schools, safety manuals, and whispered conversations between pilots before takeoff. Every time a flight crew ran through their checklists, someone would mention it, the day the engines died at 39,000 feet and a crew glided through the impossible. For Captain Daniel Reeves, the man who had commanded that flight, the world had labeled him a hero, but the title still felt heavy, almost undeserved. He often sat in silence at the back of aviation conferences as others retold his story with diagrams, technical slides, and dramatic music, reducing those 6 minutes of terror to bullet points and charts. They never captured what it felt like, the eerie quiet when both engines died, the weight of 200 hearts pressing on your chest, or the slow realization that every sound you made might be the last thing anyone ever heard. After the crash, Daniel took a leave from commercial flying. He bought a small cabin near the coast, where he spent mornings watching the ocean. Sometimes the sound of wind over the waves brought back the haunting whistle of air rushing past the powerless fuselage. His therapist told him it was normal, that trauma doesn't fade, it changes shape. So he learned to live with it, to breathe through it. But every once in a while, he'd dream of that cockpit, the flickering lights, the red warnings, the calm voice of his co-pilot trying to mask fear. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, staring into the dark, his hands instinctively gripping the edge of the bed, as if it were the yoke. But fate wasn't done with him. One morning, nearly 3 years after the crash, the airline called. They wanted him to return, not as a regular captain, but as the head of their new flight safety program. They were building a simulator based entirely on his flight, using every second of the black box data. "We want you to teach the next generation how to stay calm when there's nothing left to hold on to," the executive had said. He hesitated at first, afraid that reliving those moments might tear open wounds that had only just begun to heal. But something inside him, perhaps duty, perhaps unfinished business, said yes. The first time he stepped into the simulator, it took his breath away. Every switch, every light, every sound was the same. When the mock engine flameouts began, his body tensed, memories flooding back like a storm. The hum of the wind, the failing gauges, the silence, it all felt too real. Yet this time, he wasn't afraid. He looked at the wide-eyed trainees sitting beside him and spoke softly. "It's not about what the plane does. It's about what you do when it does nothing." His words carried the weight of someone who had faced that silence and won. The students listened as he guided them through the motions, voice calm, hands steady, heart strong. And as the simulated plane glided down, he whispered, "You're not flying the aircraft. You're guiding it home." When the session ended, the room was silent, the young pilots visibly shaken but inspired. They had just witnessed something beyond technical skill. They had seen the art of survival. News of his teaching spread, and soon flight academies around the world invited him to lecture. At one such event, he met a man who introduced himself quietly after the session. He was the son of the refueling technician who had made the fatal decimal mistake that day. The man had since retired, living quietly, burdened by guilt. "He still watches the documentary every year," the son said, his voice breaking. "He says it reminds him that people lived because of you." The captain stood still, his throat tightening. "No," he said softly, "people lived because everyone did their part, even when the system failed." It was the truth. The refueler's mistake had been human, but so was the miracle that followed. The world eventually moved on to new stories, new disasters, new heroes. But for Daniel, the silence at 39,000 feet remained the defining moment of his life. He returned to commercial flying one last time, for a short commemorative flight organized by the airline. The same model aircraft, the same route. As he stepped into the cockpit, his hand brushed over the controls like greeting an old friend. His new co-pilot, a young woman who had grown up watching documentaries about his flight, smiled nervously. "I can't believe I'm flying with you," she said. "I used to watch your interviews when I was a kid." He chuckled softly. "Then let's make sure this one's less dramatic." The flight was smooth, almost unnervingly so. The engines purred, the skies were clear, and passengers relaxed in their seats, unaware that history was being quietly honored a few feet away. But when the aircraft reached cruising altitude, something subtle changed. A flicker in the engine readings. Nothing dangerous, just enough to catch his eye. For a brief, terrifying second, he was back in that frozen moment years ago, hearing the engines sputter, feeling gravity tug. His hand instinctively moved toward the controls, then stopped. The co-pilot noticed his hesitation and said softly, "It's just turbulence, Captain." He smiled faintly, realizing how deeply the past still lived inside him. When the flight landed, applause erupted from the passengers who had learned midway through the trip that their pilot was the man who glided the miracle. Daniel stood at the door as they disembarked, shaking hands, receiving words of gratitude, though he still didn't feel like he deserved them. That night, back in his hotel room, he sat by the window watching the city lights flicker below. The reflection of the sky shimmered in the glass, endless and dark, just like that night at 39,000 feet. He whispered to himself, "No fuel, no power, no hope, but always heart." The next day, he visited the museum where the remains of his old aircraft rested. The exhibit had grown since the last time he saw it. A video loop played clips from that day, the captain's calm voice over the radio saying, "We'll try for the strip. Prepare for impact." People stopped to listen, some tearing up, some standing in awe. He walked past the crowd unnoticed and placed his hand on the cold fuselage. The guide nearby said to a group of visitors, "This aircraft became the symbol of human endurance." The pilots never lost control, not of the plane, not of themselves. Daniel closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could still feel the yoke in his hands, the weight of the world beneath his feet, the sound of silence filling his ears. But when he opened his eyes again, there was only peace. He realized that the crash had taken more than his sleep. It had given him perspective. In the silence of the sky, he had discovered something deeper than fear, the strength to face it. He turned to leave, but just before stepping out, he looked back once more at the aircraft and said quietly, "We flew without power, but not without purpose." And as the sunlight streamed through the museum windows, lighting up the metal scars of that legendary plane, it seemed almost alive again. Like it, too, remembered the night humanity proved it could glide through the dark and find its way home, Years later, the world had changed, new technologies filled the skies, AI-assisted systems ran every aspect of modern aviation, and fuel miscalculations had become a relic of the past. Yet for Captain Daniel Reeves, that single flight remained carved into the soul of his life like a scar that refused to fade. It wasn't pain anymore, it was memory, deep and quiet, waiting beneath everything he did. Every time he watched a plane cross the sky, he still heard the echo of that silence at 39,000 feet, the sound of engines dying, of gravity whispering, of human breath holding back the inevitable. He had long retired from flying now, his hair gray, his walk slower, but his mind was sharp as ever, filled with the same discipline and humility that had carried him through that night. He now lived in a small home overlooking a valley where the sky stretched wide and endless. The locals often saw him sitting on his porch at dawn, staring toward the horizon, sipping black coffee from a cup etched with the faded airline logo. Some who recognized him would wave, and he'd smile softly, but few ever knew what went through his mind during those quiet mornings. To them, he was just an old pilot. To himself, he was the man who had once looked death in the eyes and said calmly, "Not yet." A young journalist visited him one autumn afternoon, her recorder trembling slightly as she placed it on the table between them. She was writing an anniversary piece titled 30 Years After the Glide. She expected a legend, a man full of grand statements about heroism and destiny. But Daniel spoke in his usual soft tone, eyes focused on the horizon. "It wasn't destiny," he said, voice carrying the weight of truth. "It was duty. We did what we were trained to do. Fear comes later, when you realize how close you were." The journalist asked what he remembered most vividly. He thought for a long moment, the wind rustling through the trees, before answering, the silence. Not the alarms or the shouting, just the moment everything went quiet. That silence changes you. You stop being afraid of dying. You start being afraid of failing the people who trust you. She asked if he had ever forgiven himself for what happened. He smiled faintly. There was nothing to forgive. The mistake wasn't ours, but the lesson was. You can't control fate, but you can decide how you face it. And when you do, you'd be surprised how strong the human heart can be. The interview went viral when it aired. People were moved not by the technical details, but by the humanity in his words. Flight schools began quoting him again. Aviation psychologists studied his calm as a model of emotional discipline under crisis. Yet Daniel didn't see himself as a symbol. He saw himself as one man who had been lucky enough to land where others might have fallen. One winter evening, while sorting through old boxes, he found the small pink letter from the little girl who had survived the crash. The paper had yellowed, the ink faded, but her words still glowed with innocence. "You sounded brave." He smiled, touched the letter gently, and whispered, "I was scared the whole time, kid." He wondered where she was now, if she had kept her promise to become a pilot. A week later, he received a message from a young woman who introduced herself as Captain Laura Hill, the same girl, now grown, who had written that letter decades ago. She was commanding her first commercial flight and wanted him to be there for the inaugural departure. When Daniel arrived at the airport, the terminal was full of life, families rushing, children pointing at aircraft, the hum of engines rising like music. The airline had named the new jet Spirit of 982 in honor of the flight that had inspired a generation. The moment he saw the name painted on the fuselage, his throat tightened. Laura greeted him at the gate, her eyes bright but emotional. "You taught me what courage means, even when I didn't understand it," she said. He smiled. "You'll learn it again up there. Every flight is a lesson." As she boarded, she turned to look back and said softly, "I'll bring them home, Captain." He nodded, a tear escaping down his weathered cheek. He watched her plane taxi down the runway, the engines roaring, not in fear this time, but in power, in life. The jet lifted gracefully into the evening sky, the sunset reflecting off its wings like fire on glass. For Daniel, it was as if the story had come full circle. The flight that had nearly ended his life had given birth to a new generation that would carry his legacy beyond the horizon. He stayed at the window long after the plane disappeared, whispering to himself, "She's up there now and she'll make it home." That night, alone in his quiet home, Daniel sat by the fire and reflected on everything that had come after: the investigations, the fame, the teaching, the healing. He realized the crash hadn't defined his life. It had clarified it. He had seen the best and worst of humanity in one night: fear, panic, courage, and grace all at once. He had seen how thin the line was between life and loss, and how in the end, what truly mattered was not the altitude, not the aircraft, but the strength to hold on. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint hum of a distant plane somewhere above, its sound blending with the wind through the trees. For a moment, he imagined being back in that cockpit: no alarms, no fear, only silence and faith. Years later, when Daniel passed away peacefully in his sleep, pilots around the world observed a moment of radio silence at 39,000 feet. No voices, no transmissions, just the steady hiss of wind over metal, the same sound he had heard in those final moments before the glide. It was their way of honoring him, the man who had once commanded the sky without engines, without power, without hope, yet had still found a way home. The story of Flight 982 continued to live on, not just as an aviation miracle but as a lesson in the resilience of the human spirit. Visitors still came to the museum, where the old aircraft stood in quiet dignity, a plaque beside it reading, "In silence they found strength. In fear they found courage. And in the face of the impossible, they found a way to live." Every person who stood before it could almost hear the echo of Daniel's calm voice over the radio, steady, unwavering, filled with humanity. Because in the end, the world learned something from that flight. Even when the engines stop and hope seems gone, the heart still finds a way to fly. And somewhere beyond the clouds, Captain Daniel Reeves still soared, forever gliding through the silence, guiding others safely home. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet strength that exists in all of us, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more real stories of survival, courage, and humanity waiting to be told, stories that remind us that even when the skies go dark, the human spirit never stops flying.